Shadows before dawn, the Baltic Sea rolled in gray waves beneath a low winter sky, just off the Estonian coast where the island of Saaremaa meets the mainland. The surf lapped quietly against the hull of a long ship half buried in sand, not the preserved vessel of a famed chieftain, but a battle-worn craft quickly concealed beneath the earth. One skull showed a clean, square wound the blade had punched through the bone. Another skeleton bore nearly severed hands, signs of a desperate last defense. How did they develop the ships, weapons, and tactics that would make their descendants notorious? But in the cold, harsh landscapes of Scandinavia, the crucible of the North, the answers lie beneath the soils of Northern Europe, in ship burials, ruined settlements, and hoards of hidden silver left behind by those who never returned. Here, a mix of environmental, social, and political changes was underway, setting the stage for the rise of the Viking Age. This is the origin story of the first Vikings, a tale of struggle and ingenuity, of violence and adaptation. With summer approaching, food stores were nearly gone, and hunger haunted their farmstead near what would later be called Upland, Sweden. His wife Fregus stirred beside him on the straw bedding. A decision that had haunted him all winter now weighed heavily. Life in the North had always been demanding. Farming was viable, but risky. The soil was often poor and the growing season short. For centuries, the people had relied on hunting, fishing, and local trade to survive. Once filled with life, the longhouse, once home to 3 generations and several thralls, now felt desolate. His parents had died over the winter. Born Ironside came back from the east last fall. His men brought back silver, furs, and amber. They lost only 2 ships in the storms, not enemies. 2 of his 5 children had succumbed to illness, made worse by starvation. Even 2 of their cattle had been butchered early. The meat was gone before they could preserve it. One successful voyage could feed us for years, rebuild our herd, maybe even buy new land. A third had been beheaded, the clean cut of a sword visible on the neck vertebrae. She, too, understood their grim reality. Nearby, a larger burial held 33 more warriors, their remains laid out in orderly rows, weapons still in their hands. These men had not died quietly. They had fallen far from home, and their comrades had honored them with a warrior's burial. The year was around 750 AD, 50 years before the name. Viking would strike fear across Europe. They were trained fighters. Every free man had learned the use of weapons from boyhood, but had few battles to fight at home. To the east, across the Baltic, lay resource-rich lands. To the south and west, the remnants of the Roman world still wealthy, but increasingly defenseless. Expansion was becoming a necessity. All that was needed were the tools and the will. They were skilled sailors essential in their rugged coastal geography, but had rarely ventured far. A rising population strained resources. Political consolidation was also reshaping society. Small kingdoms were forming, and local chieftains could no longer afford their old forms of leadership feasts and gift-giving. Young warriors have fewer ways to gain status and wealth by serving their leaders. Inside this maritime grave lay 7 men. The sandy soil had preserved their bones, which told a grim story more brutal than any northern saga. At 16, he was already taller than his father, with the rough hands of a farm laborer. This is the solemn burial site tangible evidence of Scandinavian warriors involved in organized conflict decades before the infamous 793 raid on Lindisfarne Abbey, often considered the start of the Viking Age. These were not yet called Vikings, but they were the forerunners, the early wave of what would soon become Europe's most formidable seafaring force. Who were these early warriors? What drove them beyond their homelands into unknown and often hostile lands? But this story doesn't begin in 793. It begins earlier, in the silent centuries before, when Viking power was forged not in fire alone. The unforgiving land? The tale begins in 7th century Scandinavia, in the lands that would become Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Svein Tausen woke to the cries of his youngest child. The past winter had been the harshest anyone could recall, and spring brought no relief. "The child needs food," she whispered, voice heavy with fatigue. "We all do." Svein rose and walked toward the hearth, where a few embers still glowed. Looking through the smoke hole, Svein saw the stars begin to fade. But things were changing. The climate was cooling. Crops failed more often. As Svein fed the fire, his oldest son Halfdan entered the room. "You're thinking about it again," Halfdan said, not as a question, but a statement. Svein nodded. "The gods favor them," Halfdan said. "The gods favor those who act," Svein replied. "Bjorn sails again once the ice melts." "He's looking for men." "You leave us." Fregus had entered silently, their youngest child on her hip. "I would save us." "Or bury you far from home," she said. But there was no protest in her tone, only resignation. Conversations like this echoed throughout Scandinavia. Climate change, overpopulation, and shifting politics had created a class of men with little choice. Now, survival pushed them to look outward. The ships that changed history. To understand the Viking phenomenon, we must understand not just why they ventured out, but how. Their unmatched mobility came from a singular advantage: their ships. The classic longship was still evolving, but earlier ships, like those found at the Psalm site, already had the essential features. By the mid-8th century, Scandinavian shipbuilders had created vessels unlike anything else in Europe. Shallow enough for rivers, strong enough for the sea. Room for 40 men in their gear. Years of building vessels had curled his fingers into a permanent grip. Before him, a new hull took shape, a long, slender form like a wooden leaf. Gudmund the shipwright ran his hand along a new oak strake. "She be the fastest yet," he told Bjorn Ironside, who had commissioned the craft. Bjorn paced along its length. Unlike the broad merchant ships of the Frisians or the heavy war galleys of Byzantium, this ship was long, narrow, and finely built. Most revolutionary was its clinker-built method. Overlapping planks, like scales, made it lighter and more flexible than other European ships. A new ship and a new way of war was emerging, nimble, aggressive, and ready to range far beyond their homelands. The motivation was clear. The technology was ready. All that remained was for someone to prove the risk was worth the reward. But they weren't cheap. Each ship demanded resources and craftsmanship: tall oaks, forged iron rivets, and sails that took months to weave. These weren't desperate one-offs. They were serious enterprises, organized by ambitious men, often younger sons of chieftains, seeking power beyond the traditional order. They happened before widespread literacy, and their victims often lacked scribes. But archaeology offers glimpses, especially of eastern journeys across the Baltic. Archaeological evidence shows Scandinavians were active there by the mid-8th century, decades before the traditional Viking age. "The keel?" Bjorn asked, eyeing the spine of the ship. "We'll camp there. Send scouts ahead." At 18, this was his second voyage east, following in Bjorn Ironside's wake. In return, they sought silver, furs, and slaves. 2 days later, a delegation from a nearby settlement arrived. The Scandinavian superior mobility and warrior culture made them dangerous. With a Finnic interpreter who had visited Svein's homeland, they negotiated terms. 2 more ships followed, each carrying 30 warriors from their homeland. The warriors laid to rest there perished in battle around 750 AD, their remains marked by brutal close-quarters combat. They were interred with Scandinavian weapons and followed Scandinavian burial customs, suggesting they weren't random raiders, but an organized group operating far from home. By late summer, their vessels sat lower in the water, heavy with furs, silver, amber, and other prized items. But not every voyage ended without incident. They had crossed the Baltic Sea, entered the Gulf of Finland, and now approached lands held by Finnic and Slavic tribes. Single piece of oak. "Seasoned 3 winters," Gudmund replied proudly. "Found it in the king's forest. Cost me a silver ring to keep it quiet." And the sail? All men were armed. Swords for the wealthy, axes and spears for others. Most carried round shields reinforced with iron. My wife and daughters wove it all winter. Wool, tight woven, treated with horse fat. It'll catch any breeze. Later Vikings will be known for raids. But these early ventures were more balanced commerce tempered with readiness for violence. We fight only if we must. They could be rowed when speed or silence was needed. Most importantly, their shallow hulls let them sail rivers as easily as seas striking inland or vanishing with little warning. These ships were game changers. They could sail when wind allowed, saving energy for battle or trade. They were ideal for quick raids and for traders needing to escape danger. As Gudmund's crews shaped the hull, similar vessels were taking form across fjords and coastlines. The first ventures, the earliest proto-Viking expeditions, left behind little in writing. Halfdan stood at the front of his father's ship, watching the coastline grow closer. "There," his father said, pointing to a sheltered harbor behind a wooded headland. Their destination would later become known as Staraya Laga, one of the first trading hubs along the eastern routes. As they beached the ships, Halfdan oversaw the younger warriors setting up camp. Though the primary goal was trade, conflict was always possible. "Remember," Svein told them once the camp was ready, "we are few, and they are many. We trade first." This blend of trade and caution defined the early expeditions. They brought amber, honey, walrus ivory, and fine weapons. The Scandinavians could stay for the season, but no more than 10 warriors could enter the settlement at once, and without shields. Such rules reflected mutual suspicion. The locals valued the trade, but recognized the threat. In the weeks that followed, Svein's men exchanged goods and stories, testing the waters of a larger world that would soon feel their presence much more deeply. Local goods weren't their only focus. These early seafarers also acted as middlemen, using their ships to move merchandise between coastal and riverine settlements. The Psalm ship burials in Estonia reveal a stark contrast, a story of violent encounter. What led to the clash? Archaeology offers no definitive answer. However, later historical patterns hint at possibilities. Perhaps a trading mission turned violent after talks failed. Or maybe these were hired fighters, mercenaries, aiding one local faction against another, a practice that became common in Viking activity in the East. They might also have been raiders who met unexpected resistance. Their journey had been fruitful. They had gathered enough wealth to support their households through winter and beyond. More critically, they brought home vital knowledge of trade routes, negotiation customs, local politics, and points of weakness. Whatever the cause, the Psalm burials are the earliest archaeological evidence of large-scale Scandinavian military action beyond their borders, a grim sign of the expansion to come. Those who led expeditions successfully earned not just riches but loyalty. A new kind of leader was forming, one whose influence stemmed not just from inherited status, but from the ability to coordinate and command profitable ventures. Trade routes grew, strategies improved, and ambition swelled. The Proto-Viking era had begun, gaining momentum toward the eruption of activity that would define the closing years of the 8th century. The Frisians speak of rich monasteries, to the west places where Christian monks keep vessels of silver and gold for their god, defended not by weapons but by prayer. But even before the legendary raid on Lindisfarne would introduce the Vikings to the Christian world, a significant shift was already unfolding at home, the rise of organized power. As autumn neared and storms stirred over the Baltic, the expedition's leader ordered a return. Born wasn't just suggesting another trade journey. He was proposing ventures into the unknown ones that could include peaceful exchange or confrontation, depending on the situation. "I seek strong men and seaworthy ships. All who join me will share in what we find by trade, or otherwise." Leaders like Bjorn had to seek fresh opportunities, new destinations, and unexplored trade networks. These insights circulated through Scandinavian villages, passed on in stories told by the heart. Each new expedition built upon the last. Crafting workshops emerged to handle materials like amber, ivory, and exotic metals. Power began to concentrate among fewer individuals. For young men, it opened new roads to wealth and prestige outside inherited roles. For old elites, it threatened to upend long-held hierarchies. For ordinary farmers and craftsmen, it promised profit, but also came with demands for tribute to increasingly dominant local rulers. Blood and iron, the rise of warlords. It marked a turning point in Scandinavian expansion, one that would soon bring them into direct, often hostile, contact with the Christian realms to the south and west. A chieftain who returned with wealth could attract more followers, buy superior weapons, and expand control over rival territories. A feedback loop developed. Foreign expeditions fed domestic power, and domestic power enabled larger expeditions. Their tools of battle and the strategies they used would become infamous, not just for their effectiveness, but for the dread they inspired. 6 successful journeys east had made him richer than any of his ancestors. Sparks flew with each precise strike. This was no farm implement. This sword was the pinnacle of early medieval blacksmithing. They had the means to build bigger ships, equip more fighters, and take on more daring ventures. Their halls became regional power centers, not just local gathering spots. Silver arm rings encased his thick arms, and a fine sword traded from Frankish lands hung at his hip. The cores flexible enough to absorb blows. Behind him stood 40 battle-tested warriors who had sailed and triumphed with him. As voyages east and south brought in wealth, power dynamics at home began to change. Born Ironside stood before his community, his reputation now surpassing that of the aging local chieftain. "The eastern waters are growing crowded," Born addressed the gathering. "The Finnic and Slavic tribes now expect us." They bolstered defenses and organized their warriors. The crowd murmured. Many had planned their own expeditions, hoping to follow in Born's footsteps. "But there are other seas and other shores," Born continued. A hush fell over the listeners as they considered this new path. "I will sail west once the spring storms end," Bjorn declared. His words were carefully chosen. This reflected a growing reality. As more Scandinavians explored abroad, familiar trading partners became harder to deal with, offering poorer terms or building better defenses. Archaeological findings from this era show rising social inequality in Scandinavian communities. Imported luxuries increasingly appear in elite graves. These emerging leaders weren't yet kings in the medieval sense, but they were more than traditional chiefs. Importantly, much of their influence stemmed from their success abroad. This new system created both chances and challenges. Born's call to sail west was more than another journey. Weapons of terror, the proto-Vikings journeying abroad, brought more than goods. They carried weapons, and with them, a capacity for war that would soon gain legendary status. At a smithy near Finn's farmstead, Ulf hammered a glowing iron blade on his anvil. "It'll be ready before you sail," Ulf promised Halfdan, who watched intently. Now 20, Halfdan had joined 3 eastern voyages and earned enough to commission a sword, a major expense and symbol of status. "The pattern?" Halfdan asked, referring to the intricate designs that would show once finished. 7 rods, Ulf explained. 3 high carbon, 4 low, twisted and forge welded. The edge will slice through mail. Scandinavian sword-making used advanced knowledge of metallurgy. The best blades combine iron types hard and brittle high-carbon steel with softer, more flexible low-carbon iron. The layered construction gave both sharpness and strength with a distinctive rippling look. Still, swords were rare. Most warriors carried spears and axes. Spears worked for thrusting in shield formations or throwing at short range. They specialized in amphibious strikes, using ships to appear suddenly, attack quickly, and retreat before defenders could organize. Wealthier men might afford chainmail and helmets, though the iconic horn helmets are myth. Real battle gear prioritized practical protection. By the time they saw us, we were among their homes. But unlike rigid Frankish troops, Scandinavian warriors could break and regroup rapidly to exploit openings. Proto-Viking raiders learned early that terror could serve as a tool. Sometimes, just the threat of attack was enough for targets to surrender goods rather than resist. Axes ranging from light hand tools to heavy two-handers could crush shields and helmets. It represented a military system evolving, fusing metallurgy, strategy, and fear into a force that would soon challenge Europe's greatest powers, who were entirely unprepared. The warriors who left Scandinavia in the mid-8th century weren't just learning how to fight. They were learning how to make their enemies dread the sight of their sails. The solemn ship graves in Estonia, dated to around 750 AD, tell a particularly haunting story of early warfare. For defense, fighters used round wooden shields with iron rims and bosses. Of the 40 warriors who had joined the voyage, only 12 remained alive. In the larger ship, higher status individuals were placed centrally with prized weapons, while others lay at the ends. Another skeleton's hands were nearly severed, classic signs of defensive wounds. A third was decapitated, deep cuts across the spine, showing a powerful sword blow from behind. They fought together. Let them journey to Valhalla together. What began as a trade dispute had escalated when the local chieftain demanded more payment than the Scandinavians will provide. Their graves tell the story of a people becoming something more than traders or raiders. Game pieces found among the graves hint that they passed time during voyages playing strategic board games, perhaps similar to Nefertaf, a chess-like game later popular in Viking culture. But most striking is what these burials represent. The Scandinavians sacrificed two valuable ships, difficult to replace assets, to honor their fallen. They took the time to position the bodies with care and include meaningful grave items, even though they were in enemy territory after a costly battle. This points to both the religious importance of proper burial and the high status of those who died. They were shaping the early Viking Age, one sword, one voyage, one battle at a time. These were working ships' vessels that had carried the warriors on their expedition. Sacrificing them for burial reveals the seriousness with which property rights and burial rituals were treated, even in hostile, far-off regions. Beyond weaponry, these early warriors honed combat tactics tailored to their environments. Remember Kulin last summer? Sai reminded the younger warriors preparing for their first trip. We landed before sunrise, out of sight. We crept through the woods. The old man looked at the mounds, already fading into the dusk. The skalds will sing of them. Their families will remember them at blots. And maybe, someday, others will find these ships and know that men from our lands came this far, fought bravely, and were given honor in death. Earth was heaped over them, forming low mounds that would soon blend into the landscape. The front-facing wounds and multiple injuries suggest hand-to-hand combat, with fighters holding their ground. The presence of defensive wounds shows they were trained, resisting even as they died. Speed and surprise defined early raids. They struck during holidays, bad weather, or early morning when watchfulness waned. Quick raids, not prolonged battles, were the norm. If they had to fight, they used flexible formations to adjust on the fly. One such tactic was the shield wall shoulder-to-shoulder lines of overlapping shields, offering protection and a base for spear thrusts. More frightening than their tactics, though, was their use of fear itself. This psychological warfare would define the later Viking-era, but its roots were planted now. As Halfdan's blade took form under Ulf's hammer, it symbolized more than one man's weapon. The Dead Speak burial sites from the Proto-Viking era offer deep insights into their beliefs, social order, and the violence that shaped their world. Thorgrim the Old stood on the Estonian shore, overseeing the grim task of burying fallen comrades. "Lay him beside Gorm," Thorgrim said, as another body was carried to the smaller ship. Archaeological findings show that the burials were organized, with warriors laid according to their rank. The remains show shocking injuries. One skull has a square hole, a clean axe strike that killed instantly. These were not ambush victims. His arm was almost off, Halfdan noted grimly, inspecting one body. Still, he killed two before falling. Thorgrim nodded. Odin will welcome him, prepare him with his weapons. These men were warriors, not just in life but in death too. The burial goods offer revealing insights into Proto-Viking society. Warriors were laid to rest with their weapons, swords, spears, axes, and shields. Personal belongings included combs, knives, and in some cases, food offerings for the afterlife. The song ships were not grand ceremonial vessels like the later Oseberg or Gokstad ships from the Viking Age. As night descended, Thorgrim oversaw the final stages. The ships, now holding their somber cargo, were hauled farther inland to avoid coastal erosion. Will anyone remember them? asked a young warrior beside Thorgrim as the last of the soil was piled up. Thorgrim's words would prove true, though not in the way he imagined. The psalm burials would remain untouched for over 1,250 years, until archaeologists uncovered them in 2008. This discovery opened a rare window into a formative time just before the Viking Age, offering a glimpse into the lives. These ventures laid the economic groundwork for the later raids and linked Northern Europe with both the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. And deaths of Scandinavian warriors far from home decades before the infamous raid on Lindisfarne. He had sailed east enough times to know the routes well. We follow it to the lake the locals call Ilmen, then south along the river they call the Volkhov. His father, Sveitin, was growing too old for such long journeys, so Halfdan took charge of a crew of 30 warriors as they crossed the Baltic Sea. "Unload everything," Halfdan ordered. "We'll carry the cargo and drag the ships around the rocks." This ability to move between sea and inland waters gave them access to interior regions unreachable by ocean routes alone. Unlike earlier expeditions, this one was expected. The community now had established trading routines. These men indeed speak to us across the centuries, telling stories of violence, honor, and the beginnings of a Scandinavian expansion that would reshape Europe's political, economic, and cultural landscape. Rivers of silver, rivers of blood. The Eastern Road excavations reveal a diverse, multicultural community. Scandinavians, Slavs, Finns, and Balts all engaged in trade and craft. He's aging, but he still asks for those amber beads your wife makes. They returned with Islamic silver, often in the form of dirhams, as well as furs, beeswax, and an increasing number of slaves. Without formal institutions or written contracts, trade relied heavily on trust, shared customs, and ongoing relationships. And honey, and closer to the silver-rich lands of the East. They had forged links from the Baltic to the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, laying the foundation for future Viking networks. Without the Eastern economy, the Western raids might never have reached the scale that made them so historically impactful. This was the next frontier of expansion. New trading posts, new markets, and eventual links to the Dnieper and Volga rivers, leading to the Black and Caspian Seas. Scandinavian-style structures stood beside local ones, and workshops processed amber, bone, glass, and metal goods for both local and long-distance exchange. Though the Viking exploits in Western Europe dominate historical narratives, the first major wave of Scandinavian expansion actually moved east. Captives from local conflicts or raids, either seized by the Scandinavians or bought from others, were transported south, where both the Islamic Caliphate and Byzantine Empire had steady demand for labor. At 24, Halfdan now commanded his own expedition. "There," he pointed, as they neared the river that would later be called the Neva. By the mid-8th century, this route from the Baltic to Lake Ilmen and beyond was becoming well-trodden. Archaeology from sites along the way reveals a growing Scandinavian footprint. Distinctive Norse goods increasingly appear as the century progresses. The most prominent early settlement along this path was Staraya Ladoga, founded around 750 AD, Lake Ilmen. As Halfdan's fleet moved upriver, they faced a common challenge: rapids. This method, called portage, was key to the eastern expansion. Scandinavian ships were relatively lightweight, allowing them to be hauled over land when needed. After days of rowing and portaging, they reached Ladoga. "Halfdan's son," called a Slavic merchant as they docked. "Your father isn't with you?" "He sends greetings to Brina," Halfdan replied in a simplified trade language. These kinds of personal connections were vital. The items exchanged on these routes were wide-ranging. The Scandinavians brought iron tools and weapons, walrus ivory, Baltic amber, honey, and crafted items like antler combs. Though deeply troubling to modern eyes, the slave trade was a significant part of early Scandinavian economics. After several weeks of trading in Ladoga, Halfdan prepared to push further south toward Lake Ilmen and what would later be known as Novgorod. "There are new settlements to the south," Halfdan told his crew, "places where Slavs gather furs." This constant search for new profit drove expansion. As older markets became saturated, Enterprising leaders like Halfdan looked further afield. Each new route extended their reach and their influence. By the late 8th century, just as Viking raids began in the West, Scandinavian traders were already deeply embedded across what is now European Russia. The wealth earned through this eastern trade, particularly Islamic silver, financed shipbuilding, armed war bands, and helped centralize power in Scandinavia. As Halfdan's fleet pushed into scarcely explored regions, they were at the forefront of one of history's most influential economic expansions, connecting Northern Europe with Central Asia and the Middle East, transforming societies across continents. The Church of St. Cuthbert is soaked with the blood of God's priests, stripped of all its ornaments. The outrage in such accounts was not just due to the violence. It came from the location and meaning of the attack. Churches were considered sacred, off limits to worldly violence. That God did not protect his servants deeply unsettled many. The attackers' precision in taking valuable goods suggested not blind rage, but calculated desecration. Precious metalwork vanished, but less transportable items were left. Some monks hid. Others prayed as the raiders approached. A few younger monks tried to protect the elders and relics. The bodies showing signs of violence were usually adult males, those most likely to resist. Women and children often show signs of being taken captive instead of killed. Captives were valuable trade goods, especially in the Islamic world where demand for slaves remained high. Educated Christian captives could even be worth more than gold or silver by weight. Findings from Lindisfarne and similar sites confirm the Vikings' selective looting. As Ragnar's warriors moved through the monastery, reactions varied. "This one fights with a staff," said Huston, deflecting a desperate blow. "He's brave, at least." "Take him alive if you can," Ragnar replied. "Strong men fetch a good price in the eastern markets." It put the Vikings on Europe's map in a way that couldn't be ignored. A reputation that would make the word Viking a symbol of terror across Europe for centuries. The psychological impact far outweighed the material losses, creating an enduring sense of fear as raids became more frequent and widespread. The role of slave-taking in early Viking raids is often understated. This created a cycle. Success abroad meant more power at home, which allowed for even greater ventures. The buildings were left standing. Contrary to some later accounts, the Vikings saw no benefit in destroying what didn't bring profit. Gold and silver bands gleamed on his forearms, and his sword's hilt shimmered with silver wire. Behind him stood well-equipped warriors, armed with the finest gear his wealth could buy. Within hours, the raid was over. The monastery's treasures were stripped, precious metals taken, select books removed, and dozens of young monks and workers bound for transport. "The tide turns," Ragnar said, looking toward the sea. "We sail with it." By nightfall, they were far from any pursuit. Bjorn was pushing for a larger regional kingship justified by the need for security. By casting himself as the defender of the people, he moved closer to a formal leadership role, not just as a successful warrior, but as a regional protector. Settlements point to the rise of central hubs of power. Vikings didn't stay long after a raid. They struck quickly and disappeared before local defenders could respond. Their ships gave them the upper hand, enabling fast approaches and equally quick retreats. A sacrifice worthy of Odin, god of wisdom and war. 3 farms were burned last month. 2 fishing boats were taken. This must stop. Speed and surprise were critical. The Lindisfarne raid, and others like it, signaled a new era in Scandinavian expansion, one based on foundations laid years before, knowledge of trade routes, refined tactics, and systems for turning loot and captives into profit. Together, we can repel the Danes or strike them first. The true historical weight of Lindisfarne wasn't its novelty, it was its visibility. As Ragnar's ships vanished over the sea, leaving smoke and sorrow behind, they carried not only spoils and prisoners, but a legacy. The crucible of kings, power and sacrifice. The success of these early raids both reflected and accelerated changes back home. Scandinavian political systems were shifting. Leaders who managed profitable raids gained wealth and prestige, which in turn gave them more influence locally. Bjorn Ironside stood before the assembly at the Thing, the traditional gathering of free men to settle disputes and make communal decisions. After 5 successful Western expeditions, his stature had grown greatly. "The Danish king has sent raiders to our shores," Bjorn declared. The Danish threat was real, but also presented Bjorn with a chance. "What would you have us do?" asked an elder farmer, long respected but now too old to fight. "Unite," Bjorn answered. "Not just this district, but the 5 around it. Together we can build a fleet." His proposal marked a major shift. Traditionally, Scandinavian lands were ruled by local chieftains with authority limited to small areas. Archaeological evidence supports this trend in 8th century Scandinavia. Fortifications became more widespread and uniform. Elite graves showed increasing concentration of wealth. Bjorn also knew that practical plans weren't enough. Religious approval was critical. After the Thing ended with cautious support for his idea, he met with the local Gothia chieftain who also acted as priest. "The people need a sign that the gods approve this alliance," the Gothi said. The Western horizon, as trade routes in the east took root, some forward-thinking Scandinavian leaders began to look westward. The North Sea and Atlantic coastlines presented new challenges and new prospects. Bjorn Ironside stood on the rocky shores of what would later be called the Shetland Islands. His 3 ships had completed a grueling ocean journey from Norway far, more difficult than the sheltered waters of the Baltic. "These harbors are good," he noted to Khan, his second-in-command. "They'll protect us from the Atlantic winds." Scandinavian goods appear in local sites, hinting at trade or raiding. They saw settlements, small farming communities, mostly Pictish with some Celtic elements. These offered both potential allies and possible targets. Many areas were sparsely populated, yet controlled by local groups with their own maritime customs. "Let's see if they'll trade before we consider anything else." Violence was on the table, but peaceful trade often offered more reliable, long-term gains, especially in places they hoped to revisit. Some regions, especially Christian monasteries in Ireland, Scotland, and northern England, held significant wealth and had few defenses. They also encountered a wider variety of cultures: Picts, Celts, Anglo-Saxons, and Franks. Archaeological evidence shows that by the mid to late 8th century, Norse presence had reached northern and western Scotland. Unlike the East, where trade dominated early ventures, the West was more mixed. "We should approach openly," Bjorn said. "Show weapons, but keep them sheathed." Using hand signs and shared trading terms, they negotiated. Bjorn's crew offered iron tools, weapons, and amber, while the locals offered wool leather and information including news of a nearby Christian monastery. This approach was common. Often placed near the sea for access, these were vulnerable to sudden raids. Western expeditions differ from the East in key ways. Open sea voyages required stronger ships and advanced navigation. But it wouldn't hurt to see this wealthy place before making any decisions. Most importantly, the Western regions house rich Christian institutions, churches, and monasteries holding gold, silver, manuscripts, and other valuables. As Bjorn's group neared a village, local men approached, led by a chief marked by fine clothing and a gold neck ring. While they were indeed capable of brutal raids when it served their purpose, the Scandinavians were just as skilled in trade, negotiation, and strategic restraint when it better suited their goals. They gathered and shared navigational details, harbor locations, wind and current patterns, settlement distributions. They also collected political intelligence, learning which regions were wealthy, which were strongly defended, and which suffered internal divisions that might be exploited. "They're wary, but not hostile," Hang observed. "They've seen ships like ours before." Yet the strategies that defined it were already in place from earlier, less recorded assaults. Perhaps traders from Denmark or Frisia, Bjorn guessed. "We might not be the first to visit." Unlike Bjorn's earlier scouting trip, Ragnar had a clear mission. That infamous raid, traditionally viewed as the start of the Viking Age, was not an unexpected invasion by mysterious Northmen. It was a step up in activity from a growing and established presence. This was no trade delegation with weapons as backup. It was a planned attack on a well-known and wealthy site. While later stories would stress wild brutality, most raids were strategic operations designed to achieve specific results with low risk. Lindisfarne was a religious and scholarly hub in the Kingdom of Northumbria. Its sacking shocked Christian Europe. Capture the strong and young. Kill only if they resist. Evidence suggests that prior to the Lindisfarne raid, there were already peaceful and possibly violent encounters between Scandinavians and the British Isles. The exchange with the local chieftain was successful. They say the monks have books bound in gold, Khan said later, and silver cups used in their rituals. Few warriors guarded the settlement. Thorne considered the report carefully. "We came to trade, not to fight," he said. The practical motives behind early Scandinavian expansion are often overshadowed by stories focusing on violence. Their ventures to the west during the mid to late 8th century helped build the knowledge and networks that would become vital when Viking activity intensified. By the time monks at Lindisfarne saw longships approaching in June 793, the Scandinavians had already been visiting the British Isles for decades. As Born's crew prepared to scout the monastery, they were part of the final phase of pre-Viking exploration, a phase that would soon evolve into deliberate exploitation of Western Europe's wealth by both trade and force. The First Blood. The shift from proto-Viking expeditions to what historians call the Viking Age was not abrupt. It was marked by a broader scope and more deliberate targets. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 is often cited as the symbolic beginning of this era. Ragnar stood at the front of his ship as it neared the island monastery. 6 ships followed his, each holding around 40 seasoned warriors. "Remember," Ragnar shouted as the monastery came into view, "these Christian priests don't fight. Take gold, silver, books with metal bindings." This efficient, almost transactional use of violence was typical of early Viking raids. The Lindisfarne attack, described in horrifying terms by the Anglo-Saxon monk Alcuin, did not introduce new tactics. It drew attention because of where it happened. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as now, from this pagan race," Alcuin wrote. "The Church of St. Cuthbert is soaked with the blood of God's priests, stripped of all its ornaments." The outrage in such accounts was not just due to the violence. It came from the location and meaning of the attack. Churches were considered sacred, off limits to worldly violence. That God did not protect his servants deeply unsettled many. The attackers' precision in taking valuable goods suggested not blind rage, but calculated desecration. Precious metalwork vanished, but less transportable items were left. Some monks hid. Others prayed as the raiders approached. A few younger monks tried to protect the elders and relics. The bodies showing signs of violence were usually adult males, those most likely to resist. Women and children often show signs of being taken captive instead of killed. Findings from Lindisfarne and similar sites confirm the Vikings' selective looting. As Ragnar's warriors moved through the monastery, reactions varied. "This one fights with a staff," said Huston, deflecting a desperate blow. "He's brave at least." "Take him alive if you can," Ragnar replied. Strong men fetch a good price in the eastern markets. The role of slave-taking in early Viking raids is often understated. Refined tactics and systems for turning loot and captives into profit. Vikings didn't stay long after a raid. They struck quickly and disappeared before local defenders could respond. It put the Vikings on Europe's map in a way that couldn't be ignored. The psychological impact far outweighed the material losses, creating an enduring sense of fear as raids became more frequent and widespread. Their ships gave them the upper hand, enabling fast approaches and equally quick retreats. A reputation that would make the word Viking a symbol of terror across Europe for centuries. This created cycle success abroad meant more power at home, which allowed for even greater ventures. Captives were valuable trade goods, especially in the Islamic world where demand for slaves remained high. Gold and silver bands gleamed on his forearms, and his sword's hilt shimmered with silver wire. By casting himself as the defender of the people, he moved closer to a formal leadership role, not just as a successful warrior, but as a regional protector. Behind him stood well-equipped warriors, armed with the finest gear his wealth could buy. Educated Christian captives could even be worth more than gold or silver by weight. Bjorn was pushing for a larger, regional kingship justified by the need for security. Not just this district, but the 5 around it. Settlements point to the rise of central hubs of power. Together, we can build a fleet. Together, we can repel the Danes or strike them first. A sacrifice worthy of Odin, god of wisdom and war. Within hours, the raid was over. The monastery's treasures were stripped, precious metals taken, select books removed, and dozens of young monks and workers bound for transport. The buildings were left standing. Contrary to some later accounts, the Vikings saw no benefit in destroying what didn't bring profit. "The tide turns," Ragnar said, looking toward the sea. "We sail with it." By nightfall, they were far from any pursuit. Speed and surprise were critical. The Lindisfarne raid, and others like it, signaled a new era in Scandinavian expansion, one based on foundations laid years before. Knowledge of trade routes. The true historical weight of Lindisfarne wasn't its novelty, it was its visibility. As Ragnar's ships vanished over the sea, leaving smoke and sorrow behind, they carried not only spoils and prisoners, but a legacy. The crucible of kings, power and sacrifice. The success of these early raids both reflected and accelerated changes back home. Scandinavian political systems were shifting. Leaders who managed profitable raids gained wealth and prestige, which in turn gave them more influence locally. Born Ironside stood before the assembly at the Thing, the traditional gathering of free men to settle disputes and make communal decisions. After 5 successful Western expeditions, his stature had grown greatly. "The Danish king has sent raiders to our shores," Born declared. 3 farms were burned last month. 2 fishing boats were taken. This must stop. The Danish threat was real, but also presented Bjorn with a chance. "What would you have us do?" asked an elder farmer, long respected but now too old to fight. "Unite," Born answered. His proposal marked a major shift. Traditionally, Scandinavian lands were ruled by local chieftains, with authority limited to small areas. Archaeological evidence supports this trend in 8th century Scandinavia. Fortifications became more widespread and uniform. Elite graves showed increasing concentration of wealth. Born also knew that practical plans weren't enough. Religious approval was critical. After the Thing ended with cautious support for his idea, he met with the local Gothia chieftain, who also acted as priest. "The people need a sign that the gods approve this alliance," the Gothi said. Born nodded solemnly. "At the next full moon," he declared, "let each district send witnesses to the rite." The ritual took place in a sacred grove, encircled by ancient trees. Representatives from all 5 regions gathered around an altar stone. The meat was later eaten in a communal feast that cemented the new bonds. Born offered 9 horses, 9 cattle, 9 sheep, and 9 hogs, a grand display of wealth and sincerity. The animals were sacrificed carefully. Their blood was collected and sprinkled over the crowd using a symbolic branch, connecting everyone through shared ritual and purpose. "Odin All-Father, wise in war and cunning in peace," the Gothi intoned, raising a ceremonial spear. "Accept our offering, bless our alliance. Grant our ships victory and our land's prosperity." By tying political unity to long-standing spiritual customs, leaders like Bjorn strengthened their claims to authority. The communal nature of these events also built a shared identity across formerly separate groups. Change, especially of this scale, always provokes resistance. Such rituals played a central role in legitimizing power. Many communities valued their autonomy over the protection offered by regional rulers. Similarly, religious conservatives sometimes rejected new practices introduced by leaders who had traveled and encountered foreign customs. Remains of sacrificial animals, ceremonial buildings, and valuable items suggest regular religious rites from the 3rd to the 9th century. This political shift both supported and was accelerated by expanding Viking activities abroad. In some high-status graves, there's also evidence of human sacrifice, typically servants or slaves buried with elites. They could reward followers, intimidate rivals, and fund larger operations. And preparing the ground for a new political structure, one that would soon project its influence far beyond Scandinavia's shores. The skills needed to lead expeditions translated easily to broader leadership. And the foreign networks they created helped link once isolated communities. By the late 700s, Scandinavians were increasingly affected by political developments to the south, especially the growth of Christian kingdoms. His Saxon campaigns, which lasted from 772 to 804 AD, brought Frankish military power to Denmark's southern edge. Archaeological sites like Uppsala in Sweden show evidence of similar practices. But the Norse path was distinct in how closely it was tied to raiding and trading abroad. The Saxons resist, but many have been forcibly baptized. Those who refuse the Christian god are executed. Some say the Frankish king wanted to stop until all pagans submit to his god and rule. Scandinavia's political evolution wasn't unique. Similar changes were happening across Europe as post-Roman systems gave way to medieval kingdoms. Leaders who succeeded in foreign ventures gained not just wealth but influence. As Born's power grew, he began building a permanent center, a hall larger than any before in the region. There, he could host feasts, resolve disputes, and receive important guests. Such halls like those found at Lejre in Denmark or Gamla Uppsala in Sweden became symbols of emerging royal power. But this rise to authority was not without opposition. Traditional power and the rise of Viking kings. Local leaders often resisted the growing influence of figures like Bjorn. Still, by the late 8th century, as the Viking Age truly began, Scandinavia was evolving from a landscape of numerous small chieftains to one dominated by a few larger proto-kingdoms. The raids that would soon unsettle much of Europe were not just random acts of plunder. They became more organized, often sanctioned or even led by rising kings aiming to boost their authority and reputation. As the ritual feast continued into the evening, Born mingled with representatives from 5 districts, forming alliances offering promises. External pressure and the forge of conflict. External pressures played a major role in shaping the rise of Viking activity. Halfdan stood before King Sigurd, reporting on his recent trading journey along the southern Baltic. Charlemagne continues pushing north, he said. Sigurd, now king of a substantial territory after his father Born's death, furrowed his brow. How far north? They've reached the Elbe River, Halfdan answered. This expansion by Charlemagne posed a serious threat to Scandinavian societies. Charlemagne's methods went beyond conquest. They included forced conversions, destruction of pagan temples, and execution of those who refused to accept Christianity. For Scandinavian leaders, the message was clear: Christian rulers posed a threat not just politically, but spiritually and culturally. Or redirect our efforts to other targets rich in resources, but less risky. We have 3 options, Sigurd told his council. Wait and fight when the Franks arrive. Strike south now and support the remaining Saxons. This strategic dilemma shaped early Viking actions. Charlemagne's campaign was also a spiritual war, destroying sacred Saxon sites like the Aminsel and enforcing mass baptisms. Many leaders chose to look west toward the British Isles, Ireland, and the Atlantic Islands rather than face Charlemagne's formidable army head-on. Archaeological findings support this view. Viking raids during the late 8th and early 9th centuries focused on wealthy but poorly defended places, isolated monasteries, divided kingdoms, coastal villages. Strongholds like Charlemagne's court at Aachen were deliberately avoided. The religious aspect of this conflict is vital to understand. To Scandinavians, this wasn't just political domination. It was a direct attack on their gods and worldview. Lead them to the distant northern islands. Trade where you can. Scout for future raids. The Viking Age didn't begin with one great invasion, but through calculated, escalating efforts based on earlier experience. The Christians claimed theirs is the only God. Halfdan reminded Sigurd. It sped up the centralization of power in Scandinavia as local groups united under stronger rulers for survival. Despite their differences, the future Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes began to see themselves as culturally united, distinct from the Christian world threatening them from the south. It drove innovation in shipbuilding and weapons to match their southern enemies. As pressure increased on the southern frontier, Scandinavian expeditions shifted in other directions. This pattern suggests that external threats helped trigger the move from small-scale raiding to full-scale Viking expansion after 790 AD. Destroy our groves, our pillars. They murder those who honor the Aesir and Vanir. We'll send ships west and north to the British Isles, Frankish coast, and the Northern Islands. They were strategic actors in a wider conflict, both geopolitical and religious, whose impact would echo for centuries. We'll avoid Charlemagne's main forces for now, but strike where we're least expected. This spiritual war fueled Viking assaults on Christian centers. Raids on monasteries like Lindisfarne were not only for treasure, they were symbolic acts against a religious system seen as hostile and oppressive. Records mention frequent and growing raids. Hoards of foreign silver found in Scandinavia show wealth pouring north. The timing of intensified Viking activity aligns closely with Charlemagne's Saxon wars. Its defenses? Just monks with tools. 8 ships to the Frankish coast to raid isolated churches. The rest sail along England's coast, raiding and returning with spoils. Sigurd made his decision. Attacking it would not only bring treasure, but strike a symbolic blow at Christian morale. Rather than one large raid, they would split forces to keep defenders off balance and gather intelligence. He turned to Halfdan. Prepare 3 ships. 9 prisoners from local conflicts were hanged in a grove sacred to Odin to win his favor for the journey. Each held 30 to 40 warriors, nearly 1,000 men, the largest Norse fleet yet. The Christian lands will shake when we arrive. This was possible because of both growing organization at home and the wealth gained from previous raids. His flagship bore the raven banner of Odin, god of war. This method testing defenses, gathering intelligence, and scaling up gradually defined the early Viking strategy. The shaping of a Viking identity, the challenge from expanding Christian powers also influenced Viking society in other ways. Perhaps most importantly, it helped form a shared identity among Norse people. As Halfdan prepared for his mission, he was part of a broader reaction to foreign pressure, one that would transform both Scandinavia and Europe. The Vikings, soon infamous across Christendom, were not just bandits. The Raven banner rises. By the late 8th century, all the ingredients for the Viking Age were coming together. Stronger leadership in Scandinavia, pressure from Christian forces, technological advances, and increasing knowledge of the wider world. It all came to a head with the famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD. Ragnar stood on a cliff above the harbor. Below him, 23 ships ready to sail. "Never before has such a force left our shores," said Hastin, Ragnar's trusted lieutenant. This expedition marked a shift. Earlier ventures had involved just a few ships. But now, Scandinavian leaders could launch full-scale coordinated attacks. Evidence supports this scale of escalation. Targeted regions built defenses in a hurry. "Our first target," Ragnar told his commanders, "is the island monastery the Saxons call Lindisfarne. Traders say it holds golden gospels and silver reliquaries." Lindisfarne was an ideal target, isolated, rich, and sacred. After Lindisfarne, Ragnar continued, 5 ships head to the Northern Islands to set up a base. This spread of targets showed growing strategic depth. Before setting sail, they held a sacrifice on the beach. "Blood for the All-Father," chanted a priest. "Souls for his hall. Victory for our ships." Such sacrifices, confirmed by archaeological and written sources, highlight the religious context of Viking expansion. While wealth motivated the raids, many warriors saw them as religious offerings, acts that honored their gods. As the tide carried the fleet out to sea, dragon-prowed ships stretched across the horizon. For the warriors, this journey promised riches, fame, and danger. For their leaders, it was a statement of strength. For their homelands, it was a release valve turning internal pressures outward. The smaller raids of earlier years had become a deliberate enterprise of raiding, trading, an exploration that would reshape Europe. For their targets, it marked the beginning of an age of fear and instability. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later recall the Lindisfarne raid with dread. It marked the rise of a new power with its own rules, beliefs, and ambitions. In this year, terrifying omens came to Northumbria, and heathens destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne with savage robbery and murder. Their reach went beyond violence. They reshaped trade routes, created new settlements, altered political systems, and spurred cultural exchange. What had once been a vulnerable settlement had become a bustling marketplace where Norse ships were now common. What began with violent encounters evolved into deeper relationships involving trade, settlement, politics, and cultural exchange. As Ragnar's fleet disappeared into the horizon, the true Viking Age had begun. From the sunlit northern islands to the golden-roofed palaces of Miklagard, temporary bases gradually became permanent settlements and eventually major towns where Scandinavians and locals intermingled. In Francia, Viking threats helped accelerate the rise of feudal systems, where central rulers distributed land in return for military support. In Russia, Scandinavian warriors entered existing power structures, eventually aiding in the formation of the early Russian state. Wealth, prestige, and organizational know-how gained from overseas ventures strengthened regional rulers. By the end of the Viking artifacts reveal a blending of artistic styles and techniques, showing how cultural lines blurred over time. The trade routes developed by the Vikings connected once isolated economies into a more unified system. Silver from Islamic lands flowed north through Russia into Scandinavia and then westward to England and Ireland. Slaves captured from Slavic regions were sold to Byzantine and Islamic markets. Luxury goods such as walrus ivory from the North Atlantic reached ports around the Mediterranean. The raven banner above Ragnar's ship was more than a symbol. For the next 300 years, such banners would become the most feared sight along Europe's coasts. Maritime routes allowed for communication and trade across vast distances, far beyond the reach of the land-based powers of the time. Alongside goods came ideas, technologies, and cultural shifts that sparked innovation. Legacy of blood and silver. The rise of the Vikings changed not only Scandinavia but the wider world. They built stone halls, mint coins with Christian crosses, though they still whisper prayers to the old gods. Halfdan, now in his 60s, his beard gray, his body scarred, stood at the stern of his ship. Arriving at the Seine, some of his people had even made this region home-marrying locals and adopting aspects of Frankish. While maintaining their distinct Scandinavian identity, much has shifted since our first journey here, Halfdan remarked to his son Guthram, now commanding his own ship within their modest fleet. Back then, they ran at the sight of our sails. Now, they prepare goods for trade and keep silver ready. This change from fear to cooperation was seen in many regions affected by Viking activity. Archaeological findings across the Viking world in places like Dublin, York, and Novgorod reflect this transformation. Our ships now sail routes our forefathers never imagined, Halfdan continued. This expanding network was among the most significant outcomes of Viking activity. Political structures across Europe also adapted under Viking pressure. In England, small kingdoms began merging into larger entities to mount coordinated defenses. The kings back home now rule lands our grandfathers couldn't imagine governing, Guthram noted. This internal transformation may have been the most lasting result of Viking expansion. Age. Scandinavia's once fragmented landscape had evolved into the early forms of the medieval kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Religious change came with this political shift. Contact with Christian Europe led to conversions across Scandinavia, though the process was uneven. Some rulers embraced Christianity for political gain, even while their people clung to traditional beliefs. Elsewhere, sincere conversions spread through missionaries and cultural exchange. Your children may well pray to the White Christ, Halfdan told his son, half resigned, half practical. The old ways fade as our people marry Christian women and settle in their lands. Merchants came forward with goods. Locals greeted them in a mixed tongue of Frankish and Norse. A Christian priest stood nearby, ready with blessings in return for donations, careful not to push his faith too strongly on the visiting Scandinavians. By the 11th century, Scandinavia had largely joined Christian Europe, losing its unique religious identity, but gaining access to its cultural and political life. Even back home, Christian priests gained more influence each year. The early phases of Viking expansion were marked by brutal violence, with lasting effects on the communities they struck. The church is splattered with the blood of God's priests, stripped of its sacred treasures. This religious shift would become one of the Viking Age's most enduring legacies. In a deeply religious society, this was not only a physical, but a spiritual catastrophe. Mass graves from this period show signs of defensive wounds and executions, matching eyewitness reports of the attacks. The Vikings' sudden sea-borne assaults, swift and overwhelming, left coastal communities living in fear. Prayers from the time often included pleas for protection from the fury of the Northmen. Accounts of ritualistic killings, like the infamous Blood Eagle, remain debated among historians. Local defenses were reorganized. Churches relocated treasures or built stronger fortifications. Governments introduced new taxes to fund anti-Viking efforts. Still, there's no doubt that Viking violence had a deep and lasting impact. Populations developed strategies to cope, reducing the Vikings' early advantage of surprise. The terror they unleashed forced change and adaptation, ultimately helping integrate Scandinavia into a new European order. Communities that endured became stronger, more unified, and better prepared. The initial horror gave way to resilience. In response, Viking tactics shifted. They launched larger operations, stayed longer, and created semi-permanent bases. Wherever they settled, Vikings left lasting marks. In Normandy, named for the Northmen, and in parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, traces of Scandinavian language and genetics remain visible to this day. Christian Europe saw the pagan Vikings not just as invaders, but as enemies of the faith. Attacks on holy places were viewed as spiritual warfare, not merely economic plunder. Modern English includes hundreds of Old Norse words, a sign of the intense cultural contact during this era. When Halfdan's ships arrived at the trading post of Sen, they were met not with fear, but with the routine bustle of business. Many were taken to distant lands, never to return. The emotional cost was immeasurable. This peaceful scene between former enemies was the result of a century-long transformation. What began as desperate raids by hungry adventurers had grown into a web of trade, settlement, and cultural exchange that reshaped Europe's landscape economically, politically, and culturally. The Vikings' legacy, and that of their proto-Viking forerunners, extended beyond violence and silver. They forged ties between distant regions, spurred urban growth, encouraged political consolidation, and enriched all sides through cultural interaction. Their story is not just one of bloodshed, but of adaptation, innovation, and integration into a European world they once terrorized, the blood-dimmed tide. Despite the long-term benefits of Viking activity trade, settlement, and cultural blending, we cannot ignore the initial devastation they caused. Alcuin of York, a respected Anglo-Saxon scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote with despair after the Lindisfarne raid, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." Such reactions revealed the deep shock Viking raids caused. Churches and monasteries were not only looted and burned, their clergy were often killed, and their relics desecrated. Archaeological digs at these sites confirm the grim reality burned layers. Scattered human remains and the absence of valuable objects all point to intense violence. Beyond the physical damage, the rage triggered lasting psychological trauma. This fear was magnified by the religious clash. The Viking slave trade added another layer of horror. Unlike goods, enslaved people, family members, and friends were irreplaceable. Church records of the time tell of atrocities committed by Vikings. Though some may have been exaggerated, the terror they describe is grounded in real events. Initially, many communities were unprepared, but over time, they adapted. Watchtowers were built. By the mid-9th century, the shock of Viking raids was wearing off. Ironically, The destruction caused by early Viking attacks led to lasting improvements in military, political, and social systems. In this way, the Vikings' brutality, while terrible, also spurred transformation. The saga continues. The shift from early Proto-Viking raids to the Viking Age wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Over the next 3 centuries, Scandinavians would build settlements from Newfoundland to the Black Sea, found kingdoms, embrace Christianity, and become part of the wider European world. As we conclude, it is important to remember that the patterns laid down in those early decades before and after the Lindisfarne raid set the tone for the entire Viking era. Vikings were pragmatic. They used violence when needed, but preferred trade when possible. This strategic mindset was key to their wide-ranging success. A blend of violence and trade, flexibility, and ambition defined their approach. Success abroad gave power to local leaders, driving the rise of regional kings. By the end of the Viking Age, Scandinavia had consolidated into the early forms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. While popular culture often portrays them as savage warriors, the historical truth is more complex. From pagan rituals and attacks on Christian churches, the Vikings gradually moved toward full participation in Christian Europe. What began as a clash of faiths became a path to integration. These trading routes continued to operate well after the Viking Age ended, forming the foundation for the later commercial developments of the medieval period. Their ships were another vital advantage. Though they evolved over time, Viking vessels always retained their core strengths: shallow drafts, dual propulsion, and adaptability. What started as desperate missions by Norsemen in search of resources developed into a sophisticated system of trade, raids, migration, and politics that reached across continents. The formative Proto-Viking period we've examined laid the groundwork for all of this, testing the strategies and ideas that would define the broader Viking phenomenon. Viking settlers in England, Ireland, Russia, Iceland, Greenland, and briefly in North America built blended cultures that fused local traditions with Scandinavian influence. In geographic names across regions like Normandy and Newfoundland, and in the cultural memory that has reimagined them as explorers rather than raiders. It stemmed from particular historical conditions: environmental stress, political ambition, technological capability, and responses to external pressures. The Vikings were not monsters. They were people navigating their time with the tools and perspectives available to them. Their modern instruments, trowels, cameras, and scanners stand in stark contrast to the remains of ancient wooden ships that once sailed these waters more than 1,200 years ago. Yet this careful study creates a bridge between past and present, allowing us to hear the stories of those long dead through their bones, weapons, and burial arrangements. These settlements may represent the most lasting legacy of the Viking world, permanently reshaping the demographic and cultural identity of Northern Europe. They terrified coastal populations, but also helped establish major trade hubs. They initially resisted Christianity, but later became deeply devoted to it. Though they began as outsiders to European civilization, they helped shape the very fabric of the medieval and modern European world. By the late 11th century, most of Scandinavia had been absorbed into the Christian world, effectively ending the distinct cultural framework of the Viking Age. These features allowed unmatched mobility across rivers and seas, sustaining their influence throughout the era. Foreign ventures continued to shape politics at home. The religious shift was equally dramatic. The Viking story is not one of chaos alone, but of growth, transformation, and a remarkable legacy that reshaped Europe in ways still felt today. Life, religious conflict gradually transitioned into compromise and, eventually, widespread conversion as Scandinavian elites began to recognize the political and economic benefits of embracing Christianity. The economic networks built by early Proto-Vikings in the Baltic and nearby regions expanded steadily, developing into a vast commercial system that linked Northern Europe to Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and eventually even North America. Settlement patterns that began in the early Viking era, starting with the establishment of trade outposts that later grew into permanent towns, also expanded significantly. The Viking story, then, is one of gradual evolution rather than sudden upheaval. As we conclude this story, it is important to understand that the violence often associated with Viking activity wasn't due to some inherent savagery. Their legacy is filled with contradictions. They were both destructive and constructive, raiders and traders, rooted in tradition yet open to change. Today, the Viking legacy persists not only in archaeological discoveries or medieval chronicles, but in the DNA of modern populations. In language, the brutal beginnings of Viking activity were not just stories of war and conquest. They marked the start of a wider historical journey that continues to shape the world we live in today. Epilogue. Echoes across time. As the sun sets over the Baltic, archaeologists work patiently at the Psalm ship burials. The remains speak of both violent and respected warriors who died far from home, and comrades who made sure they were properly buried despite the risks of enemy territory. A square hole in a skull, cuts on forearms, carefully placed weapons and gaming pieces, each detail offers a glimpse into a world on the edge of great change. But they were their immediate forerunners, proto-Vikings whose voyages helped shape the strategies and knowledge base that would enable future expansion. Their journey to present-day Estonia was one of many that pushed Scandinavian boundaries, tested methods, gathered information, and built the relationships needed for the Viking Age to flourish. These men, buried around 750 AD, were not yet Vikings as we commonly understand them, those infamous raiders of later centuries. The archaeological evidence complicates simple interpretations of Viking origins. These men weren't just bloodthirsty pirates, nor were they peaceful traders provoked into violence. When we consider the more tragic aspects of their expansion, burned monasteries, murdered monks, enslaved captives, we must also recognize their advancements in navigation, trade, and adaptability. They were multifaceted historical figures shaped by their environment, values, and the challenges of their time. They are recovering a vital chapter of human history, one that helps explain how Europe and the modern world came to be. These early seafarers helped drive processes of expansion, trade, political unification, cultural blending, and religious change processes that continue to affect us today. They didn't emerge from nowhere. Their appearance was rooted in the complex conditions of 8th century Scandinavia and Europe. From modest beginnings in the resource-strained lands of Scandinavia emerged a movement that linked continents, fused cultures, founded kingdoms, and helped shape the foundation of Europe as we know it. Understanding those conditions helps make sense of their actions, not to excuse the suffering they cause, but to place it in proper historical context. The story of the first Vikings isn't just about battles and raids. It is a reflection of who we are as humans: ambitious, adaptive, destructive, and capable of reinvention. Social systems capable of organizing expeditions. Environmental hardships that motivated outward movement. Political changes both driving and responding to overseas success. And the gradual buildup of information about trade routes and targets. As with most human history, the truth lies in the middle, a blend of economic needs, political goals, technical innovations, cultural attitudes, and external threats. They remind us of humanity's dual capacity for terrible violence and incredible resilience, for destruction and creation. Studying their rise helps us better understand the forces that cause societies to change and the human tendencies that shape our shared future. They helped link isolated parts of Europe, stimulated urban growth, encouraged political unity both at home and abroad, and promoted cultural exchange that benefited all sides. What made the Viking era possible wasn't a single cause, but the convergence of several key factors: the development of highly mobile ships. The impact of these proto-Vikings reached far beyond warfare and looting. Their actions influenced the political boundaries of today's Europe, shaped languages still spoken by millions, and left lasting genetic footprints in various populations. The Vikings were not simply brutal invaders or unfairly maligned traders. The archaeologists at Psalm are doing more than recording evidence of ancient violence. The terrifying origin of the first Vikings is more than just a grim tale from the past. It's a key part of how the interconnected modern world began. The echoes of their dragon-proud ships still reverberate across time. History does not live only in books or museums, it lives in the soil, in the artifacts, and in the bones of those who came before us.